Welcome to the Hope After Child Loss podcast, where we endeavor to offer stories of hope to grieving parents and siblings so that they might rediscover life filled with meaning, purpose, and hope. We invite you to come and join us. Hello, welcome to another episode of Hope After Child Loss. I'm your host, Greg Buffkin, and I want to welcome my guest, Derek Farr, today to the podcast. Derek, it's really good to have you. I'm glad that you marked some time off your schedule to be with us today.
It's good to be with you, Greg. Thank you for the invitation.
Absolutely. Hey, Derek, before we dive into your story, why don't you take a minute or two and just tell us a little bit about you and anything that you'd like to share family-wise or work-wise, just so that people get to kind of connect with you as a person.
Okay. I'm 54 years old. Was born number 6 of 8 children. My dad and my mom, we moved around a good bit when I was a young person. I tell people how many times I've moved, and they can't believe it. I actually moved 72 times from the time that I can remember, somewhere around first or second grade to the time of graduation. And so about every month and a half in my life, we moved. And in 1990, I moved back to my home county in Alabama and became a police officer. And shortly after that, in 1993, I got married. We began to start our family, and the Lord blessed us with a son and 2 daughters. And so I've stayed stationary for the last 34 years of my life, which was not the case in the early part of my life. So I retired in the beginning of 2021 with 30 years of law enforcement, and I've been preaching. I'm also a Baptist preacher, and I've been preaching since 1993, and I've had the opportunity to be a youth pastor and a pastor, associate pastor, and right now I'm the pastor of Heritage Baptist Church in the town that I policed in all those years in Roanoke, Alabama.
Wow. Well, first of all, thank you for your service, Derek. Man, what an extreme, or 2 extremes, from moving 72 times, which is, that's a new one for me. I've known people that have moved a lot, but that takes the cake. And then you to go to now being in the same place for, you said, 34 years?
Yes, sir.
That's pretty amazing. The reason that Derek is a guest today is because, like all of my guests, Derek and his wife Becky have experienced the loss of a child, and so they are on their own grief journey. And I believe that began just a couple of years ago. Is that right, Derek? And September was 2 years ago.
Yes, we just made it through our second anniversary of Micah's heaven journey. So
Yeah. Well, man, first of all, I'm so sorry for what you guys are going through. There's no sugarcoating that. That's to go through the trauma of losing a child is just unspeakably difficult. Why don't you tell us about Micah, Derek?
Okay.
Tell us about him as a person, about him as your son.
Micah was born in May of 1994. One of the things I didn't say about my childhood, my father was he was a very abusive alcoholic, and he didn't give me any leadership in how to be a parent. But that's the one thing that I always wanted to be. I wanted to be a dad. From a little boy, I remember 11, 12 years old wanting to be a dad. 3:55 a.m. on May the 22nd of 1994, this little boy is born into the world, and he changed my life forever. He gave me the gift that I had been asking the Lord for the majority of my life at that time. it didn't take me long to realize that he was an extraordinary young man, a little boy even. And when I say that, I know every mother and father think that their children are extraordinary, and they are. Every single child has their own place in this world. But what I'm talking about is spiritually, he just had it was just like God had touched him in a supernatural way. He was just a normal little boy. He was a little cowboy when he was little. My dad bought him a John Wayne movie, and he just fell in love with westerns, and he would dress up in his all of his garb, cowboy hat, all the way down to spurs on his boots. And I remember us going when he was about 3 years old. We went to a wedding, and we went to the reception. It was a really nice, it was like a mansion, a historical mansion. And the wedding planner came to us and said that he was going to have to take his spurs off of his boots. They were afraid he was going to damage the furniture. And I looked down at him and I said, Micah, they want you to remove your spurs. And he looked up at me and he said, Daddy, cowboys don't remove their spurs. And I said, you're right. We need to leave. So we left. But, yeah. He was just he was just different. He captured spiritual things really early. He got saved on May the 7th before he turned 4 on the 22nd of 1998. He just the rest of his life he just had a connection spiritually that I had never seen before. He finished high school and he graduated Bible college the same year. He got his bachelor's degree the same year he got his high school diploma. Kept a 4.0 in both of those. But he was just a very caring young man, very willing to help. We had so many people come to us after his death and told us about how he had invested in them. And one particular young man, he's still battling with the sin of homosexuality, and Micah went to school with him. After Micah's death, my wife saw this young man in the grocery store, one of our local grocery stores, and he told her, he said, I'm so glad you came in. He said, I've been wanting to tell you and Mr. Derek ever since Micah passed away. He said, there were times in my young life at school when I struggled, and to the point where I felt like that I was going to take my own life. And he said, I remember several days when I'd be in school and I didn't feel like anybody even knew where I was at. He said, in those times, there would always be a time for me to pass him, maybe in the hallway or see him in a classroom. And he said he was always so kind to me. And he said, I knew where Micah's stand was, and I know what kind of man he is. But just for him to be kind to me like he was, tears was running down his face, and he said, I just wanted you to know that your son saved my life. Just being kind and giving me a kind word when I needed it. So
Man,
that's just who he was. He was just a tremendous young man.
yeah, wow, it sure does sound like it. And that isn't that amazing that he really didn't have to say a word. It sounds like he just simply demonstrated the kindness and compassion that that Jesus demonstrated when he was here,
Right.
and that we're instructed to do in Scripture. And sometimes when we do that, no words are needed.
Right.
It speaks volumes. He knew where Micah stood,
Right.
but he also experienced the kindness and compassion that he received from Micah. What a legacy.
Absolutely.
And I'm sure that is only one story that you're sharing. I'm sure there are probably many others that you haven't even heard.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Just the ones that I have heard would take more time than we would have for the podcast. Over and over again we heard stories, and what a blessing it was to be able to hear that. I knew of some, but I did not realize how deep he had invested in different people. There was a
Yeah.
young lady that he found out that she was depressed, and he had not seen her in a while. And so he went by her house, and her father let him in, and he told Micah that she was in her bedroom. And so he goes in her bedroom. She's laying in the bed, and he said he just talked to her, or this is her talking to us, telling us about it. He never told me. Said he just talked to her the first day, and then come back the next day and talk to her for a little bit. And said the third day, he told her, he said, okay, it's time for you to get up out of the bed, and you need to take a shower because you stink. And so she said that she got up, he left the room, and she got up and got a shower and told him that, she was finished taking the shower, and he walked back in her room. And she said, I was putting my makeup on. And he said, I'm going to go back in the living room. She said, no, it's fine. She said, I'm done. I'm just putting my makeup on. And he said, I forget how the words she said he used, that it was not proper for an unmarried young man to be in the room with a young lady while she was putting her makeup on. And so he waited in the other room for her to finish completely getting dressed, and he took her to eat, and just invested in her life. And she's married and has children, and she told us about all of that after Micah's passing. And she just talked about how just he was so willing to invest in her that he took time out of his life to try to get her out of a really dark time. And so that's just, again, story after story. And we didn't know any of this. We didn't know that he was doing. I knew he was an extraordinary young man, but he would just do things and not let anybody know what was happening.
Yeah, what a testimony to his character. And those stories like that, whether it's months afterwards, whether it's years afterwards, become treasures to us as parents, don't they?
Absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely.
I found it amazing. About 3 weeks ago, Kathy and I, my wife and I, were away in the mountains for a week. And just one night, we're watching TV, and I get a text. I didn't recognize the number, but as I read it, turns out that it was one of our son's friends. And he said he was at work and he was thinking about Ryan. And it had been almost 8 years. And he was thinking about him, and he just wanted to reach out to me and just tell me that he loved Ryan and missed him. Yeah. And I'll tell you, man, that just touched my heart so deeply. And it just, man, Kathy and I were just taken back. It just means so much when something like that happens. So I completely understand what you're saying when people share those stories. It is, that is so awesome when that happens. Derek, tell us one of your favorite memories of you and Micah together, or you and your family together when Micah was with you guys.
There's so many. He was like me. He liked to cut up and play and have fun. And I would he was my associate pastor, and I tell my church all the time that if I the pastor ever gets out of the Word of God, then you need to remove me from being pastor, because I have no authority in and of myself. The only authority a preacher has is what the Word of God gives him. And if a preacher gets out of God's Word, then he needs to be removed. And I told Micah when he became my associate pastor, he sat on the platform with me, and I turned and looked at him, and I told him one particular day, I said, it's your job to make sure that I stay on course. And I would do things and say things behind the pulpit in an obscure way to pique his interest, because he knew the Bible so well. He was 27 years old when he died, but he knew the Bible so well. I would say things just to arouse him. And I remember one particular Sunday night, I had said something, and I could tell out of the corner of my eye it caught his attention, and so I just drilled in just a little more, and I remember seeing him out of the corner of my eye sliding up on the edge of his seat. He was like right on the edge of the seat, and I seen, well, the Spirit of the Lord spoke to my heart and said, "You need to get him off the hook." And so I clarified what I was saying, and he just sunk back into the chair that he was in. I turned and looked at him, and I said, "Did I make you nervous?" And he said, "Pop," just shook his head, smiling, looking up, and he said afterwards, he said, "Don't do that anymore." He said, "I was so nervous, I thought I was going to have to get up and remove you from the pulpit."
Now, wouldn't it have been funny if he had done that just to get back at you?
Absolutely.
That would have been a memory for your church, right?
Yes, it would have.
Oh, that is funny. Derek, it is so hard to for a dad to lose his son, because there's a special bond there that that really and truly just cannot be put into words. And so I know that you miss him beyond words, and I know the same is true for your wife, and in different way for your other children as well. How has grief changed you? Because most people say that it does.
Yeah. Being a law enforcement officer for all of the years that I have been in law enforcement, still in law enforcement part-time now. I'm a school resource officer in my retirement. I've had the occasion of being in the vicinity of grief on many, many occasions. Also being a preacher, had the occasion to be in the vicinity of grief. And, I thought that I knew what grief was. I experienced losing both of my parents. My mother left in 1999. My father left in the year 2000. And so I thought I understood what grief was. But when I lost my son, I realized in that moment that I had never really been acquainted with grief. I'd been in the same room, but I had never been acquainted with it as one does when they lose a child. And it has changed me as a daddy. I was a disciplinarian, and I don't apologize for that. I think a father has to correct his children, and I was very careful in how I done that, very prayerful about it, and God guided me and showed me how to do what I done. In the time that I have experienced grief, I've I've made so many mistakes with the Lord. God has shown me through this time how kind He is. The Bible talks about God's loving kindness. I've preached for 30 years, and I've walked around that word and that title for all those years, but I never really understood it until I entered this journey of grief. And your emotions are just, they're crazy. You're as far down as you can go, and then you climb the mountain, you're as high as you can go, and it's just, with every thought you're in a different place. And making the mistakes that I made, and God having to correct me many times every single day in my own faith, seeing how kind He is and how loving He is, it has changed me. I'm not the rough policeman that I once was. I take more time to think about what I'm going to say. My wife would tell me at times in my life, she'd say, it's not what you said, but it's how you said it.
Mm-hmm.
And I was just, I'm just like real matter of fact. Even in my preaching, I was very matter of fact. I heard a quote one time, and I didn't realize the meaning of it until after Micah passed away. George Mueller said that love without truth is hypocrisy, but truth without love is brutality. That has come home to me, I guess, more than anything. I've been changed in a lot of ways, but the compassionate part of Derek Farr has been changed forever. And I felt like that I was a compassionate person prior, but I take the time not to just hear the story, but to try to get to know the person behind the story.
Yeah, and that, I hear that a lot from other people as well, Derek. I think it's impossible to live through something so unspeakable and traumatic and not come out the other side changed
Right.
and different and in a relationship with the Lord. I think that it changes us for the better. It's like I was talking to somebody earlier today who had lost a son years ago, and she made the comment, grief will either make you bitter or better. And we have a choice. We can lean into it. We can collaborate with and cooperate with God in that process on that journey, and He can use it to round off those sharp edges in our lives.
Yes.
I know I've experienced some of that in my own life as well. We as we talk about this, Derek, there are people that are listening today, and they may be in a fresh season of grief. They may be further down the road than either of us. Sometimes people wonder when we talk about the impact of grief. And grief is different for everybody. It shows up differently in most people, but we all experience the different phases of grief eventually. For you, was the impact from the grief, do you think it was greater at a physical level or a mental level or an emotional level? And there's also the spiritual aspect of it as well.
Yeah.
And I don't expect you to talk about all of that by any means, but for you, where do you think the greatest impact was?
For me, the two areas of my life that were affected the most was at the very beginning of my journey. It was spiritually. That's where it affected me. And I say that because, and I have to rewind for just a second. About 2 months before Micah passed away, the Lord spoke to my heart, not audibly. You as a believer, you understand what I'm saying. He
Yeah.
spoke to my heart. The Lord just simply gave me this thought that Micah would not live to be an old man. And you have, everybody has thoughts, and when that thought came in, of course, as a father, I pushed that away. I was like, I'm not going to think like that. And it continued, and I realized that it was not just a fleeting thought, that it was actually the Spirit of God speaking to me, to the point where I was so certain of it that about a week, maybe a week and a half before Micah passed away, I told my wife what God had told me. I told her, I said, God told me that Micah wasn't going to live to be an old man. And she said, you don't need to think like that. And I said, I don't want to think like that. I said, I've tried to push it away, but I'm certain that it's not just a thought. I really believe that it's the Spirit of God telling me. And it continued to press me to the point where probably a week, maybe less than a week before he died on a Tuesday, I told my 2 daughters that God had told me that Micah wouldn't live to be an old man.
How did they respond?
They were bewildered. They didn't say a whole lot. I remember my oldest daughter questioning why the Lord would tell me that, and they wanted to know if there was like a time frame or whatever. He was 27 years old at that time. It did not enter my mind that he was going to leave in the next week.
Yeah.
I thought God was saying that he wasn't going to live to be a grandfather.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then when he died, I'm in my front yard. I went to the wreck scene. They had come and got his body, took it to the funeral home, and I didn't get a chance to see him at the wreck scene because they were still doing the investigation of the wreck and all. And being a policeman, I know, you can't let the family come up, and so I didn't push it. I just stayed where I away. And anyway, later on that, it was probably an hour or so. The funeral home called and told me that we could come and see him, that they had cleaned him up and we could come and see him. So we went to see him, and we got back home, and I remember I was in my front yard, and everything that I believed. It left me in that moment. I didn't believe in God. I didn't believe in heaven. I didn't believe in anything. I didn't believe in hell. I didn't believe in nothing. My fate of 35 years escaped me. It just went away. And in that moment, I turned my head toward the heavens, and I don't know if I spoke out loud. There was probably 100 people in my front yard and in my house, but I was by myself. It was like nobody came around me in that moment. And I remember looking up, and I asked God, if you are real, I need to hear from you. And this is the first time that I realized how loving and how kind He is, because I had just denied His existence. And He handles me like this. He speaks to my heart very softly. He said, that's the reason I told you a month ago that your son was going to die.
Oh, wow.
Because I knew where you would be in this moment.
So He was preparing you in a way.
As soon as He spoke to my heart those words, everything that I believed came rushing back in an instant. And I was so overwhelmed, I thought I was going to pass out. I took a deep breath, and I remember looking up, and I reached up with my hand, because I remember seeing my wedding ring. I reached up with my hand physically. It was like I was overwhelmed with the universe, and I know this sounds really weird, but in my spirit, I really believe God let me touch a star, not physically,
right,
but spiritually. I feel like that because the Lord said this, He's not gone anywhere. He's just beyond this veil. He's just beyond the stars. He's right here. I felt that peace that passeth all understanding in that moment. The Lord didn't have to do that for me, but He did. He knew that I would struggle. I'm a preacher. I'm a pastor. I'm not a novice. I've preached. I've shared God's truth for 30 years, and I've sat beside people who have lost children, and I've sat beside people who have lost loved ones, and I've given them comfort from God's word. And here I am in my moment of need. I'm doubting, and God handles me very gently and very kindly. And He handled me prior to that situation ever occurring, because He knew where I would be.
Yeah, and He related to you in your role as a daddy. Yeah, you were a pastor, and yes, you were a law enforcement officer, but in that moment, He related to you as a daddy who hurt just as badly as anybody could possibly hurt. And He understood in that moment what you were going through. And He demonstrated His love and kindness and goodness to you as you needed it. Yeah, I thought that I knew God was good before we lost Ryan. I mean, I thought I did. But since we've lost Ryan, over the last 8 years, I have grown to realize at a much deeper level just how good He really is.
Absolutely.
You know, Derek, you mentioned also that grief had impacted you at another level. You said there were two levels that it primarily hit you, and one was the spiritual aspect.
Yeah.
And you described that beautifully. And thank you for being so transparent about that. What would you say the other was?
The emotional part of me was affected. I have a busy mind. Have always had a busy mind, and I don't know how else to describe it. I guess as a child, I probably would have been diagnosed with ADD or ADHD. I've got a lot of things that happen in my mind, and I've learned through the years that I have to get things out of my mind, and I've got to get them in the tangible world so I can touch them. And the way that I do that is I have to speak those things. Right? I can't leave a thought in my mind. If I leave it in my mind, it'll begin to get distorted, and it'll cause damage.
So you
with
speak it audibly.
yes. So when I speak it, then I can see it, and a lot of times I know this will make sense to um, some that'll be listening. A lot of times when I speak it, that's the first time that I realize maybe how foolish the thought was to begin with. But before I say it out loud, I actually give that particular thought access to do more than just be a fleeting thought. The old saying, you can't help birds flying over your head, but you can keep a bird from making a nest in your hair. And I say that, but I don't have any. But
I wasn't going to bring that up.
but I I learned really early in to talk about it. Um, and this is what I do, Greg, when I go into to different situations that people don't know me, they don't know, or they have been separated from me for a while. If I'm back and I'm around those people, I make sure that they understand I'm a grieving father. And just because I'm 2 years separated from the death of my son, I am I am not through this journey. I don't know if you ever get through the journey. I think you get better along the way, and God gives you strength. But the journey is going to be the journey until we meet again in eternity. Um,
Yeah.
but I
Yeah.
make
I
sure
think,
people know that that I'm grieving, and so that it doesn't take them by surprise if I do begin to weep. Um, I share my story when I have to, when I need to. There are people that are not comfortable with that, so I make sure that they understand it's okay if you're not comfortable with it. I'm not necessarily doing it so that you are informed. I'm doing it so that it's a way that I'm coping with the emotional aspect of the journey. I'm trying to get it out so that I can handle it, so that it doesn't handle me.
yeah, difficult for people to understand who haven't been there is that that loss becomes a part of your identity.
Yes.
You cannot separate a grieving parent from the loss of their child. It's like you said, a couple of minutes ago, the grief journey itself becomes less acute. The pain becomes less acute over time, but that journey is a lifelong journey until you meet your child again in heaven if they're a believer.
Yeah.
But we, like you, eventually, somewhere in the course of conversation in a relationship with somebody else, it comes up. And I think it is important because it helps them know who we are today.
Yeah.
And I'm a different person today than I was the day before we lost Ryan. I hear you saying the same thing.
Yeah.
Yeah, there is a version of you that took on life the day that you lost Micah.
I I'll give you an example of how easily I saw myself going into an emotional breakdown. It was Micah passed away in September of 2021, and this was somewhere October, late October, maybe early November of that same year.
Yeah,
I was struggling. I would go to his grave. We live across the street from the church, and Micah's buried in the cemetery next to the church, and so it's easy for me to go and visit his graveside. And I was there, and I was talking to the Lord. There are times now when I talk even to Micah, standing there, knowing he's not there, but it just helps me as a dad to be able to, again, to get those thoughts out and those feelings. But I was struggling with it, and I was talking to the Lord, and I was saying, "You raised Lazarus from the dead. You have this power. You could get him up. He's been dead for all this time, but you're God, and you could get him up. He could be raised from the dead." I was desperate. I so wanted my son, and I told told the Lord, I'm arguing with him because he's trying to comfort me, and I'm arguing with him. I'm arguing back with him, and I said, I want my son. And God speaks to my heart and says, you know, you have your wife and you have your two girls. And I spoke this to the Lord, and then God used what I'm about to tell you, I said, to shake me. God said, you have your wife and you have your girls, you have Becky and you have Katie and Ansley. And I said, take them, give me my son. And God allowed me to see what was happening in my mind. It had no longer, it was, the grief was being distorted, and it was no longer about losing my child and the proper way of grieving like a family should grieve when losing someone for this temporary time. It was no longer about Micah. It had become about me. I wanted the hurt to stop.
Right.
And I said something so foolish to the Lord in that instance. When God is trying to comfort me, I tell him, take my wife, take my girls, just give me Micah. And God just gently again, kindly again, he speaks to my heart and says, do you realize what you're saying? And I just erupted in tears and began to ask God to forgive me for just being self-absorbed. Grief is a natural course of life when it's experienced correctly. But if you allow it to get off the rails or over the banks and it becomes self-pity, it'll absolutely destroy you. And I'm very thankful that I have all of those years of being with the Lord and studying his word, and the time that I had in prayer, and the time that I had to cultivate the relationship that I had with him. When he spoke, I heard him, and I was willing to listen to him, because all of the experience that I've had in my life, when you don't listen to the Lord, that's when you get in trouble. I had enough spiritual sense and enough emotional sense to come to myself and ask God to forgive me in that instance. And I adopted this motto for my life. I said, Lord, there'll be times when I may cry and weep and grieve uncontrollably, but I don't ever want there to be a time that I weep and grieve unconsolably. I always want to keep the door open to you so that you can come in and comfort my heart.
Yeah.
I don't ever want to reject your comfort again, because in doing that, I found myself, I was going in a bad way, 90 miles an hour, and I was about to be a train wreck emotionally, spiritually, and no doubt the physical aspect of my life would have been, it would have started to decay and break down as well, because that's what happens to us. We're a triune being. We're created in the image of God, and we can't separate like he does. If the emotional part breaks down, the spiritual part is affected. And if those are affected, the physical part gets affected as well. And so I'm very thankful, again, for his kindness. And I know there's people that might listen to this and go, wow, he says he's a preacher. Man, he had some problems. And I want to be transparent so that you will understand. Don't think that you can handle this by yourself, that you're going to be strong enough to do it without God. I don't know how in the world a person navigates through without the Lord. It's like a blind man groping in the darkness without him.
Yeah. I don't either, Derek, and I wouldn't want to know. And
neither would I.
I, for one, am so very appreciative of the fact that yeah, you are a pastor and you are a dad, and you're speaking from the heart as somebody who experienced this as a dad losing his son, and grief does hard things to people. It's almost an impossibility to navigate. But with God's help, we think about that two-word phrase so many times throughout Scripture, but God, but God, but God. And we both know what that means. So if you're in that season of grief and you're like Derek, if you're in a very dark place, just call out to the Lord and tell him that. Don't hold back. And
Right.
if you have the means and you have a connection with a good grief counselor, by all means, try to make that connection. And other people are so important. God created us for fellowship with other people. And when something like this happens, that's when you really, really realize how important those relationships are. For you guys, Derek, what was it that people did right? They were the ones who just somehow seemed to know what you guys needed right when you needed it. But for
Right.
you guys, what did that look like?
The first thing that I learned, Greg, was this, and I questioned this in my ministry so many times about when to call someone, when would be the right time. For me and for my family, it was never too early to call. It was
Yeah,
never too early to reach out. This thought that maybe they need to be by themselves for this time. Maybe they need a little time to have it soak in. The people that done it right for us in our situation was those that they didn't hesitate. They came, they called, and it wasn't the words. That's another thing, that the ones that I would say done it correctly, they weren't looking for words to say,
right.
because there's no words to say. Even though me and you and the rest of those that are in this club that none of us want to be in, of losing our children, even though I can empathize with you, I don't have the words, nor would you have the words, but it's just something about the person being there. And I'll give you for instance, I was sitting on my front porch the day after Micah died. I have a huge community because I've got a large family. I have 7 brothers and sisters, and my father had 7 brothers and sisters, and so I have a huge family. So that community is large. I'm married, my wife and her family, same thing, large community. And so those two came together. I have my law enforcement community, which is huge. It reaches outside the state of Alabama into other states. And then I have my church community locally. And then also being a pastor, I have preachers all over the world. And so I've had the occasion of knowing a lot of people. I mean, tens of thousands of people in my community that I've brought together over these past 35 years. Sitting on my front porch and my telephone rings, and I look down and it's a Tennessee number. And I know a lot of people in Tennessee, so I didn't recognize the number. It didn't show up of anybody I knew. And so I just answered the phone. I said, hello. And this preacher who I know by name, we've been in the same room, but he doesn't know me and I don't know him. He said, Brother Derek, this is, and he called his name. He said, I don't think we've ever met officially. He said, but I just got off the phone. Someone called me, a preacher friend of both of ours called me, and he told me about your son. And he said he told me he wanted me to pray. They've started a prayer chain and wants me to pray and wants my church to pray. And he said, Brother Derek, I hope that I'm not calling you too soon. He said, but the Holy Spirit would not leave me alone. I had to call you. I had to reach out to you today. And I said, no, brother, thank you for calling. And he said, can I pray for you? And I said, certainly. And he prayed for me there on the phone. And he said, I would love to speak to your wife. I know y'all are busy and everything. He said, maybe in the future I'll get a chance to speak. I said, she's right next to me. And he said, would you mind if I spoke to her? And he prayed with her as well. And then the next day he called me again. And that's just, how many times have we had that thought in our mind? Maybe I should call. They don't know me. They're going to think I'm crazy. But this man, he took the chance and he called, and God used that phone call to comfort me and my wife because in those early hours, you are the emotions are so sporadic. You're up and down. And when he called, it was like God calming us in that moment. And then God used another person later on, and another person throughout those early days. But that's just a for instance of how someone done it right, and they took a really big chance on doing that.
Yeah, and that is so important because when you've lost a child, you're in such a state of shock that you're not thinking straight. You're not thinking, and most of the time you're not thinking in a very healthy way. You're just kind of going through the motions and doing what you have to do,
Yes.
what's required in the moment. And sometimes people mean well, and they'll say things like, maybe when you're ready, give me a call, text me, and we'll go out and get a cup of coffee, or we'll just talk. And what we tell people, and I know you would echo this, don't expect that phone call or
No.
that text. It likely won't ever happen. So,
Right.
as Derek said just a moment ago, take that very small risk, pick up the phone, make that call, send them a text, or just simply show up. And if it's not a convenient time, if they're not ready for it emotionally, they'll let you know.
Absolutely.
But take the risk, especially if you sense God is telling you to reach out, just do it. Just do it. As Derek said, most of the time it doesn't require words. As I can tell you, people won't remember the words that you spoke, but what they won't ever forget is the fact that you showed up and offered the gift of yourself, your presence with them, because that's what matters in those moments.
Yeah, I remember the night that Micah passed away. Your mind, as soon as it happens, when you can gather thoughts, my mind was going to all these different people that had lost their children, and one particular young lady in our town, she had just lost her son. He was 10 years old, and she had lost him. If it was a year before Micah passed away, it had just been a year. Like I said, there's probably 100 or more people in my front yard and in my house, and just the whole community. There were people coming from other states to us, and people are all around me talking to me, and all of a sudden I see this young lady walking up my driveway, and I just part everybody, and I just go straight to her, and she came up, she come walking up, and I looked at her and I said, I knew you were coming. I knew you would be here. She was still going through, it was very fresh for her, but she saw the importance of being there. And she's the only person that I remember. Well, there were two. Her and another lady were the only ones that I remember that night that had experienced losing a child.
Yeah.
That came, and I'm sure there were others that it just locked in my mind that she put everything aside and she came. And that's the community that we're a part of. We have been thrown together through the circumstances of this fallen world, and our children have been taken, and we've experienced this unnatural thing of burying our offspring, and it's something that you never even want to fathom, much less experience.
True.
But
Very true.
the community that I have been exposed to, the experience that I've been exposed to with this community, and the love that they have, and the thoughtfulness that they have, and the understanding that they have, has absolutely been one of the best experiences of my life, to be able to talk with people. And I know my friend, Brother Jimmy Sprayberry.
Yeah,
To
I
just
do.
be in his presence, and to hear his wisdom, and to talk with you when we first talked and first met on the phone. There's such a help there, just because I know when I speak to your ears, it's laying different. It's not falling on deaf ears. It's lying very gently on understanding ears.
Yeah, unfortunately, we are part of a group of people that understand one another at a level that others really won't ever be able to. And I'm glad that they can't. I wouldn't want that for
Absolutely. Me
anybody.
too.
But it also doesn't mean that if you've never experienced the death of a child, that you still can't reach out and offer kindness and compassion, understanding, your presence. You can
Yes.
be a good listener, because that's all they need. And please do, I know you would agree with this, please do ask about their child. You,
Yes.
use their child's name in conversation, because
Hmm.
it's so important for grieving parents to know that other people remember their child and are willing to talk about them. And if you had a memory of having experienced something with our child, please share that with us. Those stories are like treasures, right?
Yes, that's true. And
Yeah.
I think that's part of the responsibility of this community. I think it's our responsibility to educate those that live outside of this experience, to know, and I do this all the time, and I know you do as well. What you just said a moment ago, I try to educate people and make them, because they'll say, they'll mention him, and then they'll be almost apologetic,
Mhm.
you know, and I try to, in that moment, I try to say, no, 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 you doing that helps me. I may cry. There may be times when I cry. I'm not gonna hold back my emotion. I may cry, but it's good for me. There, you can't give me a better gift
Right.
than to talk about my child, even with those that don't bring him up. If I'm in a conversation and I know this particular person, I try to be led by the Holy Spirit. But if I know this person knows my son, I'll tell them, hey, you know, just let me share this thought with you. If you ever have an occasion that you want to talk to me about Micah, I want you to know that I welcome that. I want you to know that I need that kind of communication and connection. And more times than not, they'll begin to just pour out things.
Yeah.
I've been wanting to talk to you so long, and then just begin to share one thought after another. And so, yeah, it is very, very important that people don't shy away from bringing that child's name up.
Yeah. It's music to our ears, isn't it?
Yes, it is.
Yeah. Well, Derek, man, it has been such an honor to have you on the podcast today. I'm just so appreciative of you being so transparent and honest and open about your emotions and the impact that losing your son had on your life. I appreciate that you shared so much of Micah's life with us, that you trusted us with his story. And I think as people listen in the future to this conversation that we're having, that they're going to be blessed. And I think some are going to find a lot of hope and encouragement in what you've shared with us today. So thank you so very much.
I appreciate the opportunity. Thank you very much. I appreciate what you do. I know that this is not an easy thing for you to have this podcast, and I want to tell you thank you for doing it and allowing. I guess this is a crude way of saying it, but allowing the scab to be ripped off at times
Yeah.
in your own emotional journey of grief. It's very important what you do, and I so thank you for being willing to listen to the Lord
Yeah.
and following His guidance.
I appreciate that, Derek. It's certainly not something that I would have chosen, but it is a privilege to be able to do it. And it's a way that I can honor our son, Ryan. So thank you for sharing that. I really do appreciate it.
Yes, sir.
If you find our podcast meaningful, we invite you to follow us so that you can automatically receive the latest episodes. Also, we'd like to invite you to contact us and talk with us about sharing your story on a future episode, because every story is important and matters to God. Please reach out via email at hope@emptychairendeavor.com. That's hope at emptychairendeavor.com. And as always, thank you so much for listening.